The plane was boarding as usual, passengers filing in, finding their seats and settling down. But then tension filled the air. A white police officer, off duty but still wearing his badge, locked eyes on a black man taking his seat in first class. Something about him seemed to bother the officer. Maybe it was his calm confidence or the way he carried himself. Whatever it was, suspicion took over. "You don't belong here," the cop muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The black man looked up, confused. "Excuse me," he asked, keeping his voice steady, but the officer wasn't backing down. He demanded to see a ticket, then started pushing, physically and verbally. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some pulled out their phones, recording as the tension escalated. Then, just as things were about to spiral out of control, the black man calmly reached into his pocket, not for a ticket, but for something else. He pulled out his pilot's ID and looked the officer straight in the eye. "Sir," he said firmly, "you're on my plane." Silence. The officer's face turned pale, but this was far from over. The officer's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. A few passengers gasped, others exchanged glances. The tension didn't break, it only shifted. The black man, still holding his ID, stayed calm. But behind his steady expression, there was something else. A familiar exhaustion. He had been here before. The flight attendants stepped in quickly, sensing the situation spiraling. "Sir, is there a problem?" One of them asked the officer, her voice firm but professional. The cop hesitated. His authority had been challenged in a way he clearly hadn't expected. He glanced around, searching for support, but the passengers weren't on his side. Phones were still recording. Eyes were locked on him. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. I thought he was causing trouble," he muttered, but no one was buying it. The pilot didn't flinch. He simply slid his ID back into his pocket, then adjusted his uniform, making sure the captain's stripes were clearly visible. "You thought wrong," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry. It didn't need to be. But the cop wasn't ready to let go. His pride was on the line now, and something about the way this man stood his ground only made him more determined. The officer clenched his jaw, his fingers twitching at his side. He could feel the weight of the stairs pressing down on him, but instead of backing off, he doubled down. "Badge or not, I don't know if I feel safe with you flying this plane," he said, his voice lower now, but still sharp. A few passengers murmured in disbelief. One woman shook her head, whispering something to the person next to her. The pilot let out a slow breath, his patience wearing thin. He had spent years proving himself, countless hours of training, flying in and out of airports all over the world. And yet, here he was again, facing the same tired doubt. He could call security. He could have the officer removed. But he knew how these situations played out. The wrong move, the wrong tone, and suddenly he'd be the one people questioned. A flight attendant, sensing the rising tension, stepped between them. "Sir," she said firmly to the officer, "if you have a concern, you're welcome to step off the plane and speak to the airline staff." Her voice was polite, but the meaning was clear. The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "I just think passengers deserve to feel comfortable." The pilot met his gaze, unwavering. "Then maybe you should ask yourself why you don't." The officer's face reddened. He wanted to say more, to argue, to find a way to regain control. But before he could, another voice cut through the tension. A deep, steady voice from the back of the plane. "That's enough." All heads turned. A middle-aged black man, dressed in a sharp business suit, slowly stood up. His presence alone demanded attention. He looked directly at the officer, then at the pilot and back again. "I've been flying for over 30 years, the man said. "And I can tell you right now, the only unsafe thing on this plane is your attitude." A ripple of agreement moved through the passengers. The officer's confidence wavered, but he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. The officer's face twisted with frustration, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The weight of the stairs, the cameras, the silence pressing in on him. It was all too much. His authority had been questioned, his assumptions exposed, and now he was losing control of the very situation he thought he was handling. The businessman slowly stepped into the aisle, his gaze locked onto the officers. "You have a decision to make," he said, his voice even but firm. "You can keep pushing this, or you can sit down and let this pilot do his job." The officer scoffed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "This isn't about race," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. He turned back to the pilot, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've seen." The pilot tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And you don't know me," he replied. "But you assumed, didn't you?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the cabin, reaching every passenger watching the standoff unfold. The air in the plane felt thick, heavy with unspoken words. A flight attendant near the front discreetly picked up the intercom, her fingers hovering over the button. Security could be called in at any moment, but no one wanted this to go that far. The officer exhaled sharply, glancing around. People were watching, waiting. His badge wouldn't protect him from the truth that had already unfolded in front of everyone. Then, as if realizing he had no more ground to stand on, he took a slow step back. But just as it seemed the moment was diffusing, he muttered under his breath, something too quiet for most to hear. But the pilot heard it, and it was enough to make his jaw tighten. This wasn't over yet. The pilot's expression remained calm, but his grip tightened slightly on the edge of the seat in front of him. He had heard the officer's words, low, muttered, but unmistakable. It wasn't just disrespect, it was something deeper. Something he had dealt with before. The passengers were still watching, the tension thick in the air, but now there was an uneasy silence. The officer's step back had made it seem like he was letting go, but the way his shoulders were set, the way his jaw was locked, it was clear he wasn't done. Then suddenly, a voice crackled through the plane's speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." It was the co-pilot. His voice was steady, professional, but there was a slight edge to it, like he had been watching the situation unfold from the cockpit. "We're preparing for departure. If there are any issues preventing a passenger from taking their seat, now would be the time to step off the aircraft." It was a clear message, directed at one person. The officer's face darkened. His eyes flicked toward the front of the plane, then back at the pilot. "You think you can just embarrass me like this?" he said under his breath. The pilot exhaled slowly. "No one is embarrassing you," he replied. "You did that yourself." The officer's hand twitched near his belt, where his service weapon normally would be, but today he wasn't armed. Maybe that was what frustrated him the most. He wasn't in control here. Then, just when it seemed like the conflict had reached its peak, another flight attendant rushed down the aisle, her face pale. She leaned into the pilot, whispering something urgent in his ear. His expression barely changed, but something shifted in his eyes. He turned back to the officer, staring at him for a long moment. "What seat are you in?" the pilot asked, his voice unnervingly calm. The officer frowned. "What does that have to do with anything?" The pilot didn't blink. "Because," he said, "someone just reported a suspicious bag under a seat in first class." The cabin went completely silent. Passengers looked around, eyes wide. The officer stiffened. And then the flight attendant spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's under his asterisk seat." For the first time, the officer looked genuinely shaken. His eyes darted to the floor beneath his seat, then back to the flight attendant. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice lower now, more defensive. But the tension in the cabin had shifted. This wasn't about him versus the pilot anymore. Now, every passenger on board had a new reason to be on edge. The pilot remained still, studying the officer carefully. "You tell me," he said. A second flight attendant stepped forward, her hand gripping the intercom. "We need to evacuate the aircraft," she announced, her voice steady but urgent. Murmurs spread through the cabin, passengers shifting in their seats, looking toward the exits. The officer's hands went up slightly, as if to distance himself from the situation. "I don't know anything about a bag," he said quickly. "I didn't put anything there." But his earlier aggression, his unwillingness to back down, it all made him an easy suspect now. The pilot exchanged a glance with the co-pilot, who had stepped into the cabin. "Security is on the way," the co-pilot said. "Until then, everyone needs to remain calm." A few rows back, a man stood up suddenly. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, trying to step into the aisle. But the pilot noticed something, the way the man's eyes flickered to the officer, the tension in his movements. The pilot took a slow step forward, his voice clear. "Sir, sit back down." The man hesitated, then bolted. Chaos erupted. A flight attendant screamed. The officer, acting on instinct, lunged forward, tackling the man before he could reach the front of the plane. Passengers gasped as they struggled, the officer pinning him down, forcing his arms behind his back. Security stormed in moments later, taking control of the situation. As they hauled the man to his feet, a flight attendant rushed forward, pulling the bag from under the officer's seat. She handed it to security, who quickly checked it. A moment later, they confirmed it was harmless. The officer, still breathing heavily, stood up, brushing himself off. He turned toward the pilot, his face unreadable. "I guess I owe you an apology," he muttered. The pilot gave a small nod, but didn't say anything. He didn't need to. As the officers led the real suspect off the plane, the pilot turned back to the passengers. "Now," he said, straightening his uniform, "let's get everyone where they need to be." The tension in the cabin slowly eased as security escorted the man down the aisle. Passengers whispered to one another, still processing what had just happened. The officer, now quiet, stood to the side, watching as order was restored. He had spent the entire flight boarding process convinced he was in control, but in the end, he had been just as caught off guard as everyone else. The pilot took one last look at him, then turned to the passengers. "Thank you for your patience," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We'll be taking off shortly." A few people clapped, others nodded in quiet appreciation. The moment wasn't just about getting the plane in the air, it was about something bigger. As the pilot made his way back toward the cockpit, a flight attendant leaned in slightly. "You handled that well," she said softly. He gave a small smile, but his eyes held something deeper. He was used to handling things well. The officer finally returned to his seat, staring at the window as if lost in thought. Maybe he had learned something today, maybe not. But as the engines rolled to life, one thing was certain: the pilot wasn't flying just a plane. He was flying past every expectation that had been placed on him, and that was enough.